Hey everybody, this is Perch, and there's a comment. I do read the comments. Yes, I don't just heart them all. I do read them. I generally, the hearting the comment means I read it more than I agree with it, because a lot of you disagree with me, and you're welcome to, and I'm glad to hear your disagreement and everything else. The goal isn't to agree with you, but the goal is to say thank you for responding. In some cases, if your comment doesn't get hearted, it means that it didn't show up in YouTube's stupid studio, which seems to randomly just leave off 10 to 20% of the comments for no apparent reason. Lots of crazy stuff goes on there. But anyway, one of these comments was from Jeff Thorne. Somebody we've had on the show before. I always like his opinion on things. I think he's really smart, as a longtime comic reader, and that's really nice to see. But he makes a simple but smart point. One of those very obvious points. So let's talk about that for a moment. And he basically writes this, and I want to just read it as he wrote it, and then we'll talk about it. So he writes, I think some attention has to be paid to the fact that manga and anime are both art, sharing some of the same audience regardless of subject matter. The audiences overlap and can feed each other. Okay? He then writes, American live-action movies do not correlate with the comics that spawned them at all. They don't share complementary audiences, and there's no reason to assume moviegoers who've never picked up a comic will now decide to do so because they think Chris Hemsworth is a snack with that hammer. In short, it doesn't matter to the movie audience whether the American comics are good or bad, or even that they exist, because they were never going to be comic readers regardless of the push to try. It's a fallacy to present the models as similar when all they do is occupy similar shelf space. All right, this is a good point. This is like a correct point. In my opinion, it's not a point we have to live with, but it is correct in the moment. So let's take a look at that. If I can boil his comment down, and there's a lot of nuance to what he wrote there. So I'm going to take one aspect of it. I'm not representing his full argument, but let me just take one aspect of it. One thing that's true about manga and anime is that there's a much tighter connection between the two. The art style typically there's a push to make it look the same. The story is usually beat for beat the same or close to it. There is more of a very tight connection between the two, and to the point that a lot of anime are called adaptations. If you go to Japan and you kind of live in that market, work in that market, what you'll find is that the anime is considered an adaptation of the manga, of the story. And that word's kind of important because they make it clear that the manga is a source material, and the goal is to translate the source material as closely as possible. They do make changes, but those changes are either very rare or they're important for the book or the budget of what's going on, or they get reamed. Basically, there have been cases when the anime has done very different things from the manga, and it's typically very poorly received. That's happened in a few cases. It's also been true that sometimes anime has not adapted from the manga because they didn't have the funding. There's a kind of a famous case with, one of the earlier series. I think this happened with One Piece as well at one point, where they didn't have the funding to carry out one of the battles at the moment with the anime. So there was a delay while they had to go scrape together some funding because they needed to translate the battle like it was in the manga. And it spoke to the importance of keeping those connected. And keeping them connected also means the audience goes back and forth very fluidly. You can say that if you like the manga, you will like the anime, vice versa. It's very unusual for somebody to say, I just watch anime or I just read manga, or I don't really, I love the manga, but I don't really care for the anime. Generally, if you're a fan of one, you're going to be a fan of the other. That's true. In the U.S., as Jeff mentions, it's ridiculously the opposite. The two are very disconnected, and there's no real attempt to connect them. And so as a result, people go to the movies. They are not comic customers. They may not be aware the comics exist, or they may be just dimly aware the comics exist at one point. And there's not connections between two. Same thing goes the other direction, by the way. People who are big fans of the comics tend to look down their noses at the movies. A lot of the storylines, the Falcon Winter Soldier, a lot of that comes from the Mark Grunwald run of Captain America. Many beats of that story come from there. Yet you'll notice a lot of comic fans who are traditionalists or 80s comic fans or older comic fans talk about hating that show, Falcon Winter Soldier, that it's a blasphemy. It's not interpreting the comics. It's crap. You'll see a lot of people saying things like that. So when did this happen? Why did it happen? Well, there's a lot of reasons to it. I'll point out two. I think culturally there was more of a insistence to keep the source material pure, and that goes for both the people creating the anime from the manga and for the fans consuming it. There is a kind of a cultural pressure, and I don't know if that's the best way to put it, in Japan for people to consume both and like both and maintain the connection of both. In the US, you do not have that same behavior. The other piece is that, in Japan, people got very comfortable with animation. And even older ages became, it was not seen as a kid thing. And it's kind of a little hard to explain unless you've been there, but it is, you don't have that stigma that animation are for kids. Animation can be for adults. And when they say animation is for adults, that doesn't mean it has to have boobs or violence or it's some kind of, what's that? There's some big hentai movie back in the early 90s everybody's crazy about. I can't remember. Anyway, it doesn't have to be like that. Yet in the US or in the West, when we talk about cartoons for adults, immediately the mental image people get are that it's got to have some sex in there or it's got to have some aggressive violence. Well, I mean, the reality is manga, and anime doesn't really work that way. Maybe the anime has some nudity in it, or maybe it doesn't. It's actually kind of hard to tell. In fact, one of the kind of crazy things about anime is that you can have a show like Lum, which, 95% of it's going to be wholesome for a tiny child. And every now and then Lum loses her top and runs around with her boobs out. That happens every now and then. But it's very much it's just kind of naturally part of the content and the culture. In the US, it wasn't that way. So why does that matter? Well, because a lot of the huge moments in comics would be incredibly difficult to do in a live action film. You can animate these massive battles and these huge kind of science fiction epic kind of things, but to actually film it, produce it, would be tremendously expensive. So, whereas Japan took the route of being able to illustrate this stuff in anime and kind of accelerate on that, and then a lot of animation happening from Asia anyway, they were able to kind of make that a reality. In the US, we've been very slow to adopt those things. So therefore, to recreate those moments, to create that tight connection between comics and movies, it had to be live action. And because the budget wasn't there, because a lot of the stuff wasn't possible, you didn't get tight connection. You got very separate products. And as a result, the fan base split. So I mean, Jeff is, I'm saying things that are probably very, very obvious, but it is true. Now, his last comment is an interesting one. It's a fallacy to present the models as similar when all they do is occupy similar shelf space. He's right. The bookstore puts manga next to Western graphic novels, but they're radically different products, and they're different products in terms of attachment. Not just the book that you pull off the shelf, but what you do with that, what you read, what you consume around that. The person that's going in to buy that manga is probably going home to watch some anime based on that manga or other anime like it. The person pulling the graphic novel on the shelf, chances are they hate the movies that are being created, that they're angry that their favorite moments are not being represented. The mentality is entirely different between the two. And so some people have suggested from time to time, why don't in the movies or the shows, they put up a little message that say, go buy comics at your local comic shop. They could do that. I wish they would do that, but it's questionable if that would actually do any good. It's questionable if when you're watching this movie that bears only a passing resemblance to the comics, if somebody actually would go to the comic shop and be happy. And if they did, would they just be frustrated that the product was so very different? I mean, I think they probably would. So, what's the solution here? I mean, to me, one of the things that I still believe is a great business opportunity, and I wish somebody would do, is I do think an animation studio needs to be built up that starts translating these comics pretty much one-to-one or close to it. Now, by the way, I can't help but notice Invincible has been a big hit on Amazon Prime, and that is translating the comic pretty damn closely. Definitely it's made some changes, no doubt about it, like I said in my review, but it is doing a pretty one-to-one translation, and it's popular. I would hope that would open the eyes up of a Marvel. I mean, Christ, Marvel has the Disney Studios behind it. You're telling me they can't just start, take some of these runs and just start translating them issue for issue in a season? People would eat that up. I do believe they would. But right now, that product isn't being offered to them. And I think if we're going to try and connect the comic books to the movies or to the shows, that's the way it's going to have to be done. I think, you could modify the comic books to be more like the movies, but that's just going to cause more problems. A lot of the longtime comic readers are going to bail out because you've altered their comics significantly. I think you have to do it, a different way. You have to. I think the Invincible model is probably smart. So I hope you see more of that. I know Super Crooks from Millar World is going to be done in an animation style, and it's supposed to, be pretty beat for beat what the comic was, and that's smart. That's probably a good way to do it. But I really like that comment from Jeff. I think it's smart. I think a lot of people forget that. That is one of the big fundamental differences, and I do think, and it's one of the reasons why I don't, I've leaned away from it. He managed to articulate it way better than I do. This is one of the reasons why I hesitate to compare manga to anime. And I see people making those comparisons like, look how shitty manga is doing compared to US comics. It's like, yeah, it's not exactly apples to apples. It is a fundamentally different thing. And I think we can compare the businesses and we can say, what are the differences here? But we should recognize that there are some pretty major differences in how they come out in the audiences. So great comment. I mean, lots of intelligent stuff here. Anyway, let me know your thoughts below and what you think of all this. And but most importantly, thanks for listening.